Remembered by contemporaries as vain, capricious and troublesome, Isabella of Angoulême is a controversial figure with few people in her corner. She became Queen of England while still a teenager, but married to one of the most unpopular kings of the medieval period, King John. She would also go on to become a countess and a much disliked woman in her home country of France. But no one is a caricature, and everyone has a reason for the decisions they make. So, what was the real story about Isabella? She was probably born sometime around 1188, the daughter and only child of Aymer Taillefer, Count of Angoulême, and his wife Alice or Adelmus of Courtenay. Aymer himself was the last of his family line after his two elder brothers had died, and her mother Alice was part of an illustrious French family that had married into several branches of royalty and nobility across Europe and was herself a descendant of Louis VI of France. As a result, Isabella was the only heir to a vast fortune and lands, and had an extremely desirable lineage for any potential future husbands. We don't actually know much about Isabella herself at this point, and much of her character has been shaped by her later years as an adult. She would have been brought up with a view to becoming a noble wife or even a royal one, and this needed to come with knowledge she would need to carry out her duties. For Isabella, this would have included learning how to run a household and estate, religion, which quite often happened in a nunnery, as well as learning to read and write. Although it's unlikely Isabella would have been expected to write formal documents, instead having a scribe for that, she might have written poetry and would have owned books for herself. She would also have been the keeper of the family history to pass on to her children, although by the 12th century, this was becoming less of a duty for a noble or royal mother. In England, it was also considered in keeping to allow a daughter to learn to sing or play an instrument. It wasn't long before Isabella was required to carry out the primary purpose of young daughters in the medieval period, that of a marriage proposal, designed to create an alliance. Her father arranged an engagement with Hugh IX de Lusignan after his first wife had died. The age gap between them was significant. Isabella was not yet at the age of consent, which meant she was less than 12 years old, and Hugh was at least 20 years her senior. But the importance of the impending marriage was to dissolve the rivalry between the Lusignans and the Counts of Angoulême, as well as to unite their lands in Aquitaine, Isabella's family holding lands between Poitiers and Bordeaux. This in itself posed a threat to the Angevin Counts, who at that time was King John of England, and he had also recently given the lordship of La Marche, which neighboured Aquitaine, to Hugh. This threatened to give Hugh far more power than John liked him having, and he decided to do something drastic about it. It has often been recorded that John, who had abandoned his first wife, Isabella Countess of Gloucester, had done so because he had seen the beautiful young Isabella of Angoulême and fallen madly in love with her. Contemporary chroniclers used this story to explain why John put aside his wife, with the reasoning that he had not secured the proper dispensation required at the time of their marriage, as they were cousins. In reality, the truth was much more political. If he married Isabella, he would gain strategic lands to strengthen his grip on Aquitaine, and would also deprive Hugh of being able to gain power. Her father, Aymer, unsurprisingly, needed little convincing to break off his daughter's first engagement when presented with the fact she would become a queen, and John married Isabella on the 24th of August 1200, when she was only around 12 and he was 34. Rather uncomfortably, she would at first be housed with John's now ex-wife. When she wasn't at court, Isabella often stayed with the household of the previous queen at Gloucester, and we know this as Isabella of Gloucester's allowance was increased from £50 a year to £80 in order to pay for the Queen staying with her. And while this may sound awkward, it's possible the ex-Queen enjoyed having the young, vibrant teenager living with her, especially as she herself had never had children of her own. On top of this, she will have been well aware of John's tempers and attitudes and probably had sympathy for his new wife. Isabella was crowned on the 8th of October at Westminster and became Queen of England. However, this did not go down well with either Hugh or the French king, Philip II. Hugh defected to Philip, and in order to stem the growing power of the English crown, Philip also declared that England was now the enemy of France. He used this as a perfect excuse to invade Normandy and begin a period of conquest. Over the next 3 years, John would be driven from the lands his family had held for more than a century, and this was a direct consequence of his marriage to Isabella. So it's not difficult to see how the English people directed their anger over this loss of lands and revenues for England towards the young foreign queen who basically had had no say at all so far in her future, but the blame was still placed at her feet. This would colour how Isabella was viewed in the years to come, despite still being a child. When Eleanor of Aquitaine, the mother of the king, died in 1204, many of her lands were passed on to the 16-year-old Isabella as part of her dower, including lands in England and Normandy, such as the towns of Exeter, Wilton, Ilchester and Malmesbury. However, the loss of Normandy meant the lands there were pointless as a dower, as she couldn't claim anything from them. She was also promised lands in Anjou and Poitou, Niort, Saintes, and 6 other towns, but Isabella doesn't appear to have actually controlled any of these lands herself. The only lands she did hold in her own right were those in Angoulême, after her father died on the 16th of June 1202, and she became countess as his only heir. Her expenses as queen appear to have been paid by occasional gifts of money from the king, and possibly income from the revenue of queen's gold, which was basically an extra fine paid to the crown on top of other levies. She was very much treated as a child for much of their marriage, and Isabella had little independence. Some chroniclers at this time began to paint Isabella in the worst light possible. She was known for having a volatile temper, which was probably at least partially due to her young age, but was obviously not an ideal trait for a queen to have. She was also known for her beauty, with the medieval beauty ideal of blonde hair and blue eyes, and this was combined with false stories of John remaining in bed until noon with her, to produce an image of her as a siren figure, luring the king away from his real duties. There were even rumours, ironically, of her infidelity, which again, there is no evidence for at all. In reality, Isabella was simply a young queen with a husband who was juggling a war with France, as well as dealing with debts there from his brother's reign. A very telling sign about Isabella is that John's mother, Eleanor of Aquitaine, readily accepted the young girl and apparently got on well with her. While there is an argument that Eleanor might have simply been happy to have a daughter-in-law who was also French, she herself had faced slurs about not being English when she married Henry II. She was also, however, a great leader in her own right in Aquitaine and a powerful political figure, and there's no doubt Eleanor would not have looked happily upon a young girl who prevented her son from ruling effectively. By 1207, Isabella had also performed the main duty expected of a royal wife, that of becoming a mother. On the 1st of October, she gave birth to the child and heir of both John and herself, Prince Henry, at Winchester Castle. Despite having been previously married, John didn't have any legitimate children yet, another possible reason for dissolving his previous marriage, although he had 6 illegitimate children who were obviously barred from taking the throne. Young Henry would be followed over the next few years by his siblings, a brother named Richard and 3 sisters named Joan, Isabella and Eleanor. All 5 would go to either become heads of state in their own right or marry into royal families and have their own children, with the exception of Joan. In February 1214, Isabella travelled with John to Poitou, where he was able to gain control over her lands in Angoulême, which was also the first time she had visited since gaining them on her father's death. This was part of John's wider need to reclaim Normandy as well from Philip, but it would go badly. He was already struggling at home in England because he had fallen out with the northern barons there, due to them owing John a huge amount of debt and having little in the way of French lands to care about. Many of those within the royal household who were part of John's military forces also joined the rebels, which caused more tension. However, John had built up a friendly alliance with Pope Innocent III and the Holy Roman Emperor Otto IV, and some of the French landholders. But unfortunately, due to the fallout with the barons, many of them refused to fight for John. And when John pushed forwards from Poitou towards the French king's forces, it was with mercenaries making up half the numbers. While at first John had a few successful campaigns, the local Angevin lords refusing to join with him and fight on his side meant he soon started to lose ground to Philip. Eventually, Normandy was solidly lost, with the French king winning key battles against John's allies to the north. It was clear the battle was over for John, and he turned Anjou over to Philip, as well as signing a truce between the two countries that was meant to last 6 years, before returning home to England in October with his tail between his legs. Isabella had remained in England during this time in the West Country. But by 1216 her circumstances would change dramatically when John died on the 18th or 19th of October, aged just 49. Due to his unpopularity, rumours quickly abounded after his death that he had been poisoned, but these were likely false. Isabella wasted no time in ensuring her young 9-year-old son was crowned at Gloucester Cathedral as Henry III. Most of King John's treasure had been lost in the Wash, a bay on the east coast of England, and so Isabella gave up her own golden circlet to be used to crown her son. Her dower was released shortly afterwards, and she used this to make gifts to the monks at Malmesbury and St. Nicholas's in Exeter. However, despite being the mother of the king, Isabella appears to have had no place on the royal council, once again pushed aside. But she very much knew her place, and she continued for the rest of her life to use the Queen's seal and her title as Queen of England. Although her dower had been released, it was supposed to include the castles of Exeter and Rockingham, as well as some money from John's will, but none of these were given to her. Left with only her existing inheritance from France to lean on, Isabella had to return to Angoulême the following year in 1217. But she was not permitted to take any of her children with her, leaving them in England with their eldest brother Henry. For the first time in her life, Isabella was able to wield real power in her own right. John had put officials in charge who protested at a woman taking over, but she managed to claim control over her lands in Angoulême regardless. However, by 1220, Isabella would marry for a second time. Ironically, this would be to the son of the man she was once engaged to, Count of Le Marche, Hugh X of Lusignan, the son of Hugh IX. Hugh X was actually betrothed to Joan, Isabella's daughter, and Joan was being brought up at the Lusignan court as a result. But apparently, once Hugh saw Isabella, who was still only 32 and very beautiful, he changed his mind and decided to go for the mother over the daughter. A year later, Joan instead married Alexander II of Scotland. This marriage also allowed Hugh to enact what his father had attempted to do years before, bringing together the Lusignan lands and the lands from the Counts of Angoulême. However, it was worse than this, as Isabella, as a previous queen, was supposed to ask permission for another marriage from the King's Council. At first, this was ignored, and Hugh was even allowed to claim the lands John had given Isabella in England. But after Hugh joined an alliance with Louis VIII in June 1224, the French king, the council decided to repay her flippancy and Hugh's choice by taking away her dower lands and stopping her pension. Both Hugh and Isabella retaliated by threatening to keep Joan with them, and the council responded to this by writing to the Pope with letters signed by Henry III, asking for the couple to be immediately excommunicated. Unsurprisingly, this rather extreme request was ignored, and it wasn't long before the council decided it would probably just be easier to come to terms with the new Countess of Le Marche in 1226. Alexander II was eager to marry his new bride, and they didn't want anything to damage this relationship. Isabella was given the Stannaries in Devon, the £3,000 she was owed from her pension, and the revenue of Aylesbury to make up for the land she had lost in Normandy. This second marriage was at least secure for Isabella, and she would go on to have another 9 children by her new husband. The eldest, Hugh XI of Le Marche, would gain not only the title of Count of Le Marche, but also the title from his mother of Count of Angoulême. Isabella also got the opportunity to meet her firstborn again, Henry III, when he came back to England in 1230 after his ill-fated official invasion of Poitou in an attempt to claim his birthright, the first time she would have seen him in over 12 years. However, yet again, her husband was not faithful to her, although he had no illegitimate children. This, combined with constant threats of divorce from Hugh, meant it was an unhappy marriage, and Isabella's character once again came under fire for this, despite her not actually being the problem. She was also rubbed up the wrong way by her peers, as she was now merely a countess and not a queen, and yet her use of her title of Queen of England shows that Isabella had a very different view of this. When Isabella and Hugh were summoned to the French court to swear fealty to the brother of the French king, Louis XI, to be invested as Count of Poitou, Isabella was snubbed openly by his mother, Dowager Queen Blanche. It was said this was the reason she then turned on the French king along with her husband, but again, the real reasons are likely to have been more political. In 1241, Poitou was firmly under the grip of the French crown, and it would have been in Isabella and Hugh's interest to remove this grip. Luckily for them, Isabella's son happened to be the King of England, and so she persuaded her husband to reopen negotiations with England while remaining friendly with Louis. Henry did travel across to Poitou the following year in 1242, but was met with a bit of a shock when Hugh decided to side with Louis after all, leaving his royal stepson without support. According to some sources, in 1244, after this alliance between Louis and Hugh once again failed, 2 cooks were arrested in the royal household for attempting to poison the king. They claimed to have been in Isabella's pay, but there is little evidence for this beyond the accounts of these chroniclers. It was supposedly for this reason that she decided to retire to a nunnery, the Abbey of Font-Revol, although it's more likely it was simply her age. It was common in the early medieval period for noble and royal women to retire for a life of religious contemplation in their later years, although they would have continued to live in a great deal of comfort compared to the nuns. Having taken the veil as a nun on her deathbed, Isabella finally died on the 4th of June 1246. Despite the fact she had fallen out with her son Henry, respects were still paid to her in England, and gifts were given to the canons of Ivy Church in Wiltshire, money was given to chantry chapels at Malmesbury and Westminster, and a feast for the poor scholars of Oxford and Cambridge was also funded in her name. Isabella is a very invisible figure, even though she became such a caricature of a bad queen. In reality, we actually have very little of the real Isabella, because she was not able to make much of an impact in her own right. But what we can do is disseminate the myths around her, that of a spoiled, impatient brat of a queen who was the cause of her husband's lack of competent rule, and on top of that, cheated on her marriage. In fact, she was a young girl brought from her home country to one she had never even visited and was immediately looked down upon for not being an English bride. And John's lack of leadership was multifaceted, but it certainly wasn't down to being in bed with his queen until midday. She was given little in the way of independence, but when she finally had it for a very brief period, Isabella showed she was capable of leading effectively by taking her lands back under her claim, and by marrying well for a second time, even if it wasn't a happy marriage. Isabella was not the vain, capricious and troublesome woman she is painted to be. She was rather an example of a woman of her era, royal but still denied power and independence due to her age and the political state of affairs in England at the time. If you enjoyed this video, don't forget to like and subscribe so you don't miss any new documentaries.